So good morning folks, welcome to today's Sunday Debrief. It's Monday, Rich spoke yesterday, and we're just going to reflect on the service. I'm Nick, I'm a member of the church. I've got here Ravi as well, and Mark. So, hiya, welcome. What's the purpose of Sunday Debrief? It's really just to recognise that on Sunday it's so important to come together. We're gathering together as a community of believers. And in that service, we allow God to move. We allow God to move, and there is a message that's given, the sermon. And yesterday was the leader of our church, the pastor, Rich Rycroft, was speaking. And we also have an amazing time of worship. And right at the beginning of this, I want to say praise God for 4 salvations.
Yeah.
Yesterday, which was amazing. One of them was in the youth as well, and at least one of them was brand new to the church. So God had been working in his life and brought him in, and a friend of yours?
Friend of mine, yeah. Mark, if you're watching.
Yeah, hey Mark. It was just lovely to speak to some of those people that got saved yesterday. But today we're going to kind of reflect on the sermon again, and just kind of maybe unpack a little bit of what Rich was saying. So before we unpack it, we've got some clips of people's initial responses from the sermon.
He was talking about not looking at the problem, about looking at God. Yeah. And for some reason, we always look at our problem. So it just, I don't know, it just tied together for me. That I'm looking at maybe even that wall of like saying I don't need God to help me with this situation. Yeah. Whereas actually that's the very thing that we need, is God to help us with the situation, to point us into that direction.
Amen. When he was saying look up, something said to me, look up Matthew 17:8.
Okay.
So I did, and then I can read you what it says.
Yeah, sure.
So after the message was all about look up. So I looked up, and the message, what I saw, I was quite shocked when I seen it. The first thing that popped out to me was the word look up, words look up.
Yeah.
So that was quite profound.
Oh wow.
And then the whole message said, when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus.
Wow.
And I looked up while I was sat in the church, and the big sign above me read Jesus.
Wow.
So that was very strong confirmation that today we heard nothing but the words.
Yeah, man.
So yeah, welcome back. So what did you guys make of the sermon? So Rich basically was talking, he brought 2 passages from the Bible. Let's get into the 2 passages. So the first one was from 2 Kings.
2 Kings 6.
Chapter 6, verses 8 to 23. And the other one was from Acts chapter 9. And the first passage, 1 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6.
2 Kings,
was all to do with Elisha. Being able to discern from God that there was a bigger picture going on in the spiritual realm. And his servant recognised there was this massive army that had come against God's people. And he was looking at the issues and didn't know what to do about it. But Elisha had this special connection with the Lord, and he found out that there were weak points in the defences. And the perspective is interesting. It's from the king of the enemy army, trying to work out who's letting me down here. Out of my team of core generals, I guess, of the army, the people that he kept close to him, one of you must be kind of sharing our secrets of our attack, because Elisha was working out exactly the enemy's plans. And Elisha was able to strengthen that area that was weak, and literally the enemy king was just getting freaked out by this. Rich, what's your initial response to that?
I've got a few notes that I've put down. I was noticing in 6:10, So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and time again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. So that just shows, like, often there's like multiple warnings, isn't there?
Yeah.
From the Lord.
Yeah.
That was one thing I picked up, and let me have a look then.
I think that's a really interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
I'll just get my notes out as well.
So
Yeah,
God is he's often trying to engage with us, giving us giving insight, Elisha obviously has a real connection with God. He's got an invested relationship with God. He's got a prophetic gifting, and he's able to sort of interpret God, and that connection with God is able to do that. But to be able to get what was on God's mind heard, and then Elisha was able to act on it.
I noticed something. Then it goes on into Acts later on, but obviously we're going to probably talk about Acts later on. But this is what was sort of showing that there's a heavenly battle going on all the time. That, often we might not be aware of it.
Yeah.
So it forwarding on to verse 15, when the servant of the man of God got up and went out early next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. And then verse 16, "Don't be afraid." The prophet answered, "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So it's just showing what we know in like a natural sense.
Yeah.
What is going on in like a supernatural sense.
Yeah.
We might not be we might not be aware at all.
We might not be fully aware.
Or we might be aware at some point. And I'm thinking about, like in Acts, the stoning of Stephen, and he said, towards the end, he said, I see the Father up there and whatever, and you could.
He's got that spiritual connection.
It's that
and
spiritual connection.
Yeah.
And I heard recently, I can't remember where it was, but it might have been like a prophecy testimony kind of thing that somebody. This was like a future event, so when it would be, but somebody they lost their sight and they were getting sort of tormented for their faith in some way. Yeah. And but the Lord then enabled that person to have like a supernatural sight, and then he could see what was going on, even though his eyes weren't even present.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So that is, in some ways, God worked with his disability, I guess, but effectively. Our physical sight and our spiritual sight are very different things, aren't they? Do you have any thoughts on that, Ravi? Because I know...
Yesterday, it made me really, really think about what it means to have those eyes to see is like... It's going to be one to explain, isn't it? When we're vulnerable, it works. Yeah. So it just really made me think God can't do his work in the first place unless we're vulnerable, and in our weakness he's made strong. Yeah. And it got me thinking, like, just the sign of the cross, Jesus is like outstretched. And when you're not vulnerable, when you're scared, you're shelling up. But when you're not scared, you're outstretched, and the most vulnerable part of your body is showing. Yeah. And it's just a sign of like looking up to God is kind of being vulnerable, because Rich was talking about he's seen everything we've done. Yeah. He knows our inner thoughts. He knows everything. So at first that sounds a bit scary, but after you're like, no, God can work with this. Yeah. God knows our future and our pasts, and in our vulnerability, He can kind of be our eyes in that way. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think when we're vulnerable, that does. When we're vulnerable, God really works with that. It's important to be aware of our own fallible nature. Yeah.
God is the one who is God, but in our fallibility, hopefully we are putting down pride, and God is able to work with us. We recognise that God has all authority, and I think it's really important that God also he takes us through steps. He takes us through steps. When you're a new Christian, you don't necessarily get the bigger picture of the spiritual realm. Yeah. And many Christians might even go through life without actually experiencing any of that. That sort of insight of what's really happening when we look up. When we look up at God. So when we do, as what Rich was saying, the anablepo from the Greek, which is to look up at God, rather than the blepo, which is looking at the problem. Yeah. Or at the issue.
I'm slightly smiling about the Anna. I don't. You can edit this out if it's not appropriate. But
is this the Anna angle?
I've actually done. I actually have drawn the Anablepo graph for the mathematicians out there. Yeah. So we got X where we're looking on the level, and Y where we're looking up.
Right. Why?
I call it the Anablepo graph.
That is good to the Anablepo graph. I like it. Yeah. And that actually is a really good example, Mark, because let's say this is your starting point. You're at this point as a Christian. Now, the reality in the spiritual realm is there is tons going on. We do not have great insight. However, as we walk with God and we go along this line, God knows what we can and can't deal with. Yep. He knows exactly what. He doesn't give us more than we can cope with. And when we face challenges and we come to God, He allows us to grow in those moments. He allows us to face trials, and He allows us to grow. And you get to a certain step and you think, I can't deal with this. But if you stick with God, then He will allow you to cope, and you will also learn the blessings that come from it. That is the same when God reveals what's actually happening in the spiritual realm. My experience is that, for example, spiritual warfare might actually freak quite a few people out because it's having an insight into what's happening in the spiritual realm. And God doesn't take us straight into that as a Christian. Yeah. It's a process. My eyes have been gradually opened to what is going on.
Can I say a good way that God lets us learn that, in fact, is sometimes we've got a big spiritual battle in our life. Yeah. And we're like, oh, this is bad, I can't take this to God. Yeah. But we try anyway to fight this problem ourselves. Yeah. Because you think you're knee deep now. Yeah. I better do something before I'm waist deep. Yeah. And then sometimes you're struggling so much, and then it takes you to get neck deep by the time you're like, okay, God, you do it. Yeah, and
absolutely. Just that's like that. So true. Yeah, that's just like exactly that. Right. But through all of that, through all of our struggles, we're looking at the issue, aren't we? Yeah. And we're like, oh, I know how to sort this out by what I understand. It's natural. All human beings will do that. Yeah. But all of the development as a Christian, sanctification, being drawn into an understanding of what's actually happening in the spiritual realm, God gives us these steps. But the important thing, the most important thing, from my experience, is to stick with God and acknowledge that He is in absolute control, and He oversees everything, which is kind of where Rich was getting to in his message.
I think it's a way, when you start looking at yourself, you're like this graph, you're on that downward thing, but we need to sort of look beyond to Him, innit? It's like you can start a new day and look to Him, and just almost like kind of forgetting about yourself, because Debbie said at the start of the message, innit? How much of is it you or is it God? Yeah. In you, there was this. She pictured it as a leather wall with writing on, and you know, it's like when you start looking at you, say, oh my word, I'm just, you know, I'm a horrible person, whatever, I've done this, that and wrong, and, you know, this week, you know, somebody cut me up on the road, and I was just like, I reacted.
You react to it in a human way.
In a
worldly, sinful way.
But when you start looking at him, it's like you can almost like forget about you and just focus on him, and
Absolutely. And when you, Ravi, said about your vulnerability and opening out, it's hard to do that. Our instinct initially, when we face a problem, sometimes is to curl up into a ball. Now, when you curl up into a ball, you're curling into yourself. It's a protection. It's like, this is the best thing I can do to protect myself.
Hardening.
But when you sin, all sin is focusing in on yourself. And it's all curling in onto yourself. And the enemy loves that because at the same time, you're isolating yourself. When you open yourself up as well, you're actually recognizing that in your vulnerability, when you stand with God, then you're anablepo, you're looking up to God, and you may not see the massive army, God's army, and all of God's plan to overcome whatever the enemy is throwing at you, or whatever the circumstances in life are throwing at you that you're finding difficult, that are a real challenge. God's got this. He's got the bigger picture. You may not see that God's got all of this in the spiritual realm. I don't know the ins and outs of exactly how God is using his angels at any one time, or what's happening in the spiritual realm, but there is stuff going on.
I think because we don't know how it's going on, that's how God's glorified. Because if we knew how it worked, then we wouldn't get into that little panic sometimes.
Yeah.
So it takes us being in that panic and getting rescued from that panic for God to be glorified. Because when you know how hard it is for yourself to get out, and you're like, this is impossible. And then your mind is verging on the fact that, like, oh, even God might be looking at me thinking like he's a lost cause. But when God does it like that, you're like, glory to God. And you're like, I should have done it in the first place.
Absolutely.
But if we did if we did know all the time how much stronger God is, and how it's nothing for him to send his army. Because we always think, oh, it's a war going on in my head with good and evil, but it's like, no, God's already won.
He's already won, and that's the key thing, isn't it? It's and Rich was talking about this a lot. The act of looking up to God when you see a problem in front of you, whatever the problem is just entrusting it entirely to God. It's remembering and knowing He has won, and He defeats the problem, because God's victory is infinite. Whatever the enemy throws at us, whatever situation life throws at us, we have to stand in looking up to God. Otherwise, those issues are going to defeat us. Even as Christians, we can get entrapped, and we can struggle and face times of endured trials sometimes, beyond what we need to because of God. Now, over the last few weeks, I've faced massive trials because I had flu, and then I think I caught from my daughter's school COVID, and I was off out of the picture for weeks and weeks, and I was in a really vulnerable place, and it's hard when you're in a place of vulnerability to look up to God sometimes. I've been there really recently. I've only just kind of come out of it, but that is where you grow. You grow when you look up, and you grow and you can move on with God, and you come out of it stronger. But the looking up is absolutely essential.